was born in San Francisco. I'm the oldest of 5. There was 3 boys and 2 girls in the family. We lived out in the avenues in the fog, and then probably around 44, late 44, my folks bought a summer cabin up at Lagunitas. And it's sort of interesting when you think of how we transport children today. My parents at that time had, because you couldn't get a car during the war, a Chevy business coupe. And with 5 children and grandma in the car, that means that the youngest child was on the shelf behind my mother. The next youngest would be straddling the gear shift, and my father put a mattress in the trunk and a 2x4 in the hinge, and it had the spare tire mounted on the back, and the other 3 of us would ride in the trunk, waving to everybody all the way to Lagunitas. And of course, Ross Valley, and particularly Fairfax, you couldn't get through there in those days in the summer. It was hotter than hell. But in 1947, we moved to Marin County, southern Marin, opposite Alto on the freeway, 7 Thomas Drive. So I grew up in that area. My mother was a Cub Scout mother, and Carl Heinemann sponsored the Cub Scout troops outside of Mill Valley. So it was 2 dens. So that was my introduction to the fire department, was Carl Heinemann, because we'd meet down at his station in Alto. And growing up in that area, a little bit older, whenever there was a grass fire, probably like every other boy, I'd chase after it and start pulling hose and all that. And to my delight, I discovered they took down my name, and a check came from the county fire, for a couple of those fires. So I guess maybe my fire service career started back in the mid-1950s or early 50s. And in 53, we moved out to Belvedere, where I then became acquainted with the infamous Bunk Mercereau and the Belvedere Fire Department. When the horn went off in Belvedere, you got off the road because all the volunteers came screaming down out of the hills, and horns blowing and disobeying every traffic regulation there was. And I got to know Bunk a little bit through the years. And then when I became probably about 16, started fooling around with cars. At that time, we had a mobile gas station down in Tiburon. Jack Ishmael retired, and he became the Tiburon volunteer fire chief. And as I recall, I think all he did was sit around in his chair all day, and the district got tired of that, and they hired a young man by the name of Frank Busher to become chief. And Frank was so young and had displaced this lovable old Jack Ishmael that none of the other old-time chiefs would talk to Frank for pretty near a year or so. He was ostracized for bumping out old Jack out of his position. But Frank, modernized, upgraded that department made a 2-story station out of it with living quarters up above. That was the first remodel of that building. And then I went to Tamalpais High School, College of Marin, ended up being drafted into the Army. So I decided I didn't want to just spend 2 years packing a rifle and the rest of it. So I volunteered for the Signal Corps. I figured I'd pick up some skills. So I became a lineman for the post signal. So I learned how to climb poles properly, meaning that I used to be a tree hugger when I used to trim trees prior. I was lucky I didn't burn and fall out because it wasn't using the hooks properly. Anyway, I went to Fort Gordon after finishing up at Fort Ord for post-signal school. And then they said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Gee, what's the Army group out at Presidio? Might as well put in for home, right?" So I put down 8th Army. Well, the orders came in, 8th Army. 8th Army was Seoul, Korea. And 6th Army is in San Francisco. So it always, you should investigate before you write things down. It makes a difference. But we ended up at Camp Casey, where a lot of the fellows in the fire service here had also served in the Army at Camp Casey. And that's about 30 kilometers north of Seoul, right on the 38th parallel, which runs just north of here. And there I've climbed everything from radio towers to tree limbs. And when that tour was over with, I came back to the States and ended up at Fort Ord in combat development, which was really exciting for me because we went down to Hunter Liggett, and it was how the helicopters should fly as they're getting ready to put together this airborne mobile infantry units for Vietnam.
About what year?
Oh, that was, let's see, that would have been 63. Because I was 62, I was in the 61 to 63 is when I was 64 when I was in 3 years. So I spent all that time down in Hunter Liggett, and we were responsible for over 500 miles of field wire for the different testing positions. And it was a good job because nothing could start until we finished our job. And I learned there that if you had the information, you were in control. And all the officers, all the NCOs, they all wanted to be back at Fort Ord with their wives. And another buddy and I were just PFCs and specialists. We controlled all the wires so that we were indispensable. We had the notes, we knew where all the connections were, and we had to reestablish everything in the morning because field cattle and wild pigs would chew our wires at night, and the program couldn't start until we reestablished communications. And then following my Army career, I came back home, and my brother Larry had been in the Tiburon Fire Department as a paid man, and he had started off there as a resident firefighter or sweeper, and now he was in the Army. And I said, why should I pay rent? I'll go down to Tiburon, become a volunteer, and live in the firehouse. After all, I've lived in barracks. This will be simple and easy to do, and save my money so I could invest in real estate. So that's how I went in there, and I was working in San Francisco at the time, and my job there was a little bit on the dead end side. It was a refrigeration and air conditioning, and I just saw I wasn't going anyplace there. It was all unionized, and you just couldn't get into the union unless you were the son of somebody. So the fire service under Frank Busher's direction was exciting. I saw there was a lot more to it than just polishing engines and hanging around waiting, for a fire to develop. And I got the idea that you can almost create your own job, your own positions, if you wanted to put forth some energy. And that's what I was interested in doing. And there was a chance to hire on at Sausalito or Novato. And my interests were all in Southern Marin, so I took the test at Sausalito. And I was the first hire out of the group. Steve Osborne and Dustin Lear were part of our group, were hired later after me.
When was that?
1966. I was hired March 1st, 1966. There was a new chief in town, Buck Maston, and he was hired. A little background on that, the prior chief, Matt Perry, had been there, longest serving chief in Sausalito ever. And because of the family influences, nobody messed with Matt's. And the city now had changed its format and hired a city manager. The city manager came into the firehouse one time, and Matt saw him come in, but he kept reading his paper and reading his paper. And finally he put it down. What do you want, Charlie? Well, I know what had to go through Charlie's mind is there's going to be some changes around here. So when Matt's retired, they searched and they came up with Buck Maston, who had been in the infantry in World War II, amateur boxer, training officer in Bozeman, Montana, and very squared away guy. So he was hired to make change. So when I came in, and a few people ahead of me, hired by Maston, because he was hired in 1965, we were the new breed. We were going to make the changes and the difference, and that's what we were being hired for. So Buck Maston, I admired the man. He was a doer. He made things happen. He wasn't afraid to make changes. And he was there until 1972 at the department. He had remodeled it, bought new apparatus, new equipment. And then we had a Chief Howland, who was a bat chief out of Sacramento, and he lasted 6 months and he took off. He said, "This is not for me." And then Bob Quayle became chief. And Bob Quayle was a fantastic guy. I could have worked my whole career for Bob. He was just one fun guy. We had a lot of leeway. In other words, the personnel in the department, and as far as I was concerned, myself, could be creative. And during that time, we got involved in fire prevention, all these things. I guess under Maston, I got involved in fire prevention. And mentioned George Hedema earlier, by Bob Beadle. George was my mentor when it came to fire investigation. And the unique thing about George was he thought out loud. So all I had to do was trail behind him and listen to what he was saying. And we're doing this tape here in Novato here. And that was one of the calls I went out with George. Was out to some subdivision here. The garage was burned out and gotten into the kitchen. And nobody knew how this fire started. And we started digging around debris, and the old hot water heater was down close to the floor. And George picked up this old GI can, and we turned it over, and there was a hole that rusted through the bottom. The gas had gone out, pilot light, off went the structure. Also, the fire investigation team, we went around to get experience. We would investigate everyone's fires, for the most part, in the county. So we got around, and it was fun investigating, following the clues, following the burn patterns. And you got known throughout the county. Sometimes I got letters written back for the chief that I said things in my investigation report that I shouldn't have, that they found fault with. But it was like they overhauled too much, threw everything out. How can you investigate, But, well, initially the first station was on a pier next to the Horizons restaurant. And then the pier has collapsed now. Then it was moved across the street to Mr. Ford's property. At that time, the city jail or holding cell was in the fire department because Mr. Ford had a young son, John, who used to like to hang out at the fire department. The condition of using his property or donating the property to the city at that time was they had to get rid of the jail cell. He didn't want bad influence of his son. But John got chewed out one time because the city fire engine, the first mechanical fire engine, was so slow John could outrun it on his bicycle. And when the city, then later on after fire, the Altamira burned in 1927, and then the city got its first real engine. That was the Seagrave, 27 Seagrave. And that old engine went to Tam Valley. It was donated to them. Sausalito then relocated in 1941 to the present location. And the building was 4 bays, and 1 bay was used for where the guys ate. There was what later became the tool room. That was the kitchen. And in 47, they built the offices to the side, which became the day room and another kitchen. The chief had his office upstairs. And Buck Masson remodeled it, and we doubled the size of the station. Don Olson was the architect, same architect on the Fairfax station when that was replaced. And then just recently, the whole thing was torn down, rebuilt. But I did make an addition to it, which is sort of interesting, reflecting what you could do in the earlier days. A gas station became available on the corner around from the firehouse. So I asked the owner, can I have it? Because I wanted a couple extra bays for various extra pieces of equipment I had scrounged up. So he said, sure. So he took a good tax credit on the building. I jacked it up on pipe scaffolding and got the city backhoe. And I have a photo. It looks like I'm pushing the station down the street, but the backhoe is really pulling it. The guys worked on this thing. And for next to nothing, we had 2 extra bays and a shop and an air room attached to the building. So I operated without going back to the city council most of the time, asking for funds. Always found money through the GGNRA. We had a contract with, because we responded out to the park. So with that, I was able to buy all kinds of equipment. We started up a high rescue team there because we were the biggest manpower in southern Marin. So we would be out at that time on the cliffs, rappelling on the cliffs, picking people who got stranded out, or go over the side in the vehicles. We then also, I got an airboat. Later on, I got the county to buy the airboat so we could respond to the houseboats on the mud flats. And I got a 24-foot Sea Ray from the Army Corps of Engineers. We made that into a fireboat. One of the other big things about the Sausalito Fire Department, 1947, they got their first ambulance. So we were always in the ambulance business. And one of the things was that the most senior man was always the driver, unless it was a young gal in the back, and then they bumped the recruit out of the back. And often they wouldn't even tell the new guy who came in where the ambulance was. It wasn't in the firehouse. It was in Keaton's mortuary across the street in one of Keaton's garages. So they said, call will come in, get in the ambulance. And the poor guy's running around, doesn't see an ambulance anyplace. You know, come on, you know, it's across the street. And in fact, that was sort of the difference. At that time, the old timer said, you learn it like I learned it, the hard way. You know, you discover it yourself, basically, because they didn't want to tell you anything. You had to find it out yourself. Another thing was we had an air horn on top of the station, and we had pool boxes downtown and throughout the hills. But nobody told anybody about the air horn going off in the middle of the night. And that was part of the initiation process, is watch this guy elevate off his bed, you know, and what's going on? And the other thing was it always blew at noon, so one of the old firemen, his habit was always to adjust the Venetian blinds so we could peek out, but nobody could see us at the windows and watch the jumpers when the horn went off at noon or at 5 o'clock. But those were some of the old days. Some of the guys in the fire department, Swede Peterson, he was Mr. First Aid, and he was quite a guy, and has a beach named after him, Swede's Beach down in Sausalito. And Max Robinson, another old-timer, came out of World War II. Harold Cardwell liked to drink a lot off duty and go clamming, and he'd always bring these big stew pots up to Station 2, and I'd be at duty with him, and you always knew how much he drank off duty is how much hot sauce he put into the stew, and I always blamed him for my receding hairline for having to eat all that hot stuff. But the department evolved, and these people, you know, moved on out, and the newer breed came in. And like I said, under Bob Quayle, it was fantastic. And we had a fellow by the name of Steph Garraway who became a captain at Tam Valley and then got promoted to chief there, and started building a new station, and he came down with leukemia and passed away from that. Bob Quayle then went over to Tam Valley to finish up that station. And Bob at this time wasn't known at the time that he had Lou Gehrig's disease. And and when he went over there, Bob Souza and Larry Martinez went with him to Tam Valley. So we had a lot of promotions and changes. So in my career, I held every position from firefighter, first class, to lieutenant, to captain, battalion chief, fire marshal. The only thing I didn't have was training officer, and that was fine. So it was a rapid change. So in 10 years, I had an opportunity to test for the chief's position. And it was really between Al Jones and myself. We were the two top candidates testing. And there was no way our personalities would match that I could work for Al Jones. So I really didn't want to go on a 40-hour week because I was doing a lot of things off duty. And but I just couldn't work for Al, so I tested for it and got the position. And then we had lost these 3 people, and it was a big struggle because the city council didn't want to replace the people. So as mentioned earlier, other experiences in other departments, like Bob mentioned in San Anselmo, we started running a lot of overtime until that started getting burned out. At that time, it was a whole brand new system come out by Grumman called the MPO nozzle system. This is a radio-controlled nozzle, so you could run your pumper from the nozzle. Well, the personnel thought, my God, that's going to eliminate, and the unions went nuts because they thought it was going to eliminate the engineer position. That wouldn't need anybody on the pump panel. Of course you would need somebody on the pump panel. But to me, it's ridiculous that somebody down inside around the corner is waving his arm, calling on his radio, trying to get over the pump noise to turn the water on or turn the water off so I can move the hose or this and that. But you could do that with the radio-controlled nozzle. That was 1976, 77. And everything was going great. And we had the guy working on installing it in the second engine, the American La France. And he couldn't get any pump pressure. So he kept winding up the pump with the radio-controlled nozzle. And suddenly, the engine took off and committed the ultimate sin, knocked over a Sausalito parking meter and crashed into the wall across from the station. And did a lot of damage to the engine, too. And flipped one guy who was the installer, took out his knee, damaged his knee, and that became another issue. But anyway, that was the end of the MPO nozzle system. But it also changed fire apparatus from that point on. There was also another runaway in San Jose and a third one elsewhere. Before, you had a light on your dash that said you were in pump. But that came right from the shift lever. It had nothing to do that the pump had actually engaged from road to pump. So now they had to move another control down under the lever. So as the lever moved into pump, it would engage the light. So it was a positive indication that you were in pump. But, you know, I always thought that we need, well, I guess one of the things I've always really pushed for is efficiency in the fire service. We got to maximize what we're doing. And I don't think the fire service got a lot of things, but still I think it's inefficient when it gets down to the fire ground. It's still a man on the end of the hose. When we went to bigger 3/4 inch lines, we increased the gallonages and flows, but still, you put down a monitor, people are still sitting out there anchored on it. You know, it's inefficient use of manpower, in my opinion. People got to be more flexible on the fire ground. But Station 2, yes. Okay, that was opened by, actually, that was owned by Matt Perry at the time he bought the snorkel truck. And at that time, Marincello was talked about being developed. The whole Wolfback Ridge was going to be developed. So it was put there primarily for the development on the other side of 101. We manned that during the night. And at daytime, we would come down to Station 2. And people would always ask me, well, why don't we close that station? I mean, city council would ask that. I said, well, when you pass the city ordinance that nobody can park on the streets, then we don't need that station. Because up in the hills, like a lot of the older communities here in Marin, the streets were put in the horse and buggy days or whatever, very narrow. All the cars are parking on the street. People have parties. They come in, they even block it and restrict it further. And I always felt it was very important to have two-direction response whenever possible to other calls up in the residential areas. And that was the importance of that station. So we'd go up at night and man that and come down during the day when people left, you know, a couple hours earlier, nothing burning, come on down the hill. And it became a cell site, so the city made arrangements with cell phone companies. We put in generators, put in radio towers. The city still gets revenue out of that site. And during the remodel, they moved the whole department up there to that site and lived out of there. Now, they're not using that, or at least not occupying it, which difference of philosophy, I guess. But I see the fire problem, I think, has changed unique, where back in the 60s, particularly in Sausalito, we were the crash pad for the Haight-Ashbury to come over and get some sunshine. And many of these old mansions up on Buckley and Harrison were rented out very cheaply, and these people would move in, and all they had was mattresses and candles. And there was a period of time when we virtually had a fire on my shift every other shift. So we took fire very, very seriously because it was happening. And also the same individuals gave us a lot of traffic with the ambulance. We had, they were into various drugs. And one incident I remember, a young fellow came down from Washington State, went over to Oakland, came to San Francisco, got involved with a group of these people, came over to Sausalito, took some LSD, and jumped out of a window of this building, but the ground was only a few feet down. So he ran down to Alexander Avenue and threw himself in front of a bus coming up the hill. The bus stopped. He ran across to the Cordeshire Apartments and jumped off the roof, thought he could fly. Well, he went down about 4 stories, and we got the call, and I was on the ambulance then. We boarded him, gave him CPR in the verticals. We went up the ambulance, and we kept his color until we got him to Marin General. But his femurs had gone through, lower legs rather, had gone out his heels, I mean, from the impact and everything. He was internally messed up, but it was a lot of exciting calls there, a lot of ambulance calls, a lot of wrecks on the Waldo. I've gotten involved later as a chief on the Golden Gate Bridge regarding wrecks. San Francisco would respond with their aerial, and we responded with an engine. We were always called by the bridge or the CHP to go out. They would stop traffic, and we could go out because traffic would back into San Francisco, as you can realize. So we could come the opposite direction against traffic. And it was a major head-on collision with a pickup truck and some Porsche. Porsche was flipped over. The fatalities involved. But the Porsche continued being inverted. The gas kept coming out, and San Francisco had limited water, and they couldn't put out the fire. So Steve Osborne was the engineer at that time, pulled the foam line off the engine, put it out and says, "Is there anything else I can do for you, fellas?" And nope, so it took off. So I get this phone call, "What are you doing responding into San Francisco?" Because the North Tower is the Marin County line. San Francisco's up to the North Tower, we're mid-span. So we went over, and Chief Blackburn over there was quite a character. I had other run-ins with him. But anyway, so we had a big hash out. And I said, well, if the bridge or the highway patrol calls us, we're going to respond. As we walked out, the bridge district says, "We'll call you." And the highway patrol says, "We'll call you." So we continued to respond out there. And one of the groups I belonged to, and Bob Marcucci, Hank Howard, and myself, was called NAFERS. And that was Fire Equipment Research. And it started down in Southern California as SAFER, and then came up here. So Hank was the first president, Bob was vice president, I was the treasurer, secretary, whatever it was. So I was the first one to go through all 3 chairs of that organization. But I was always into equipment and really enjoyed that. But
About when was that?
oh, it had to be in the 80s or sometime in that time frame. Fire prevention, went through the chairs there, and the chief's organization, went through that, and mentioned the numbering stations. It always sounded crazy to me, sitting down there in Station 1 Sausalito, and you hear all this mutual aid response. Everybody, Station 1, Station 2, responding all the way up the whole line. That was ridiculous because you didn't know by the station numbers. You had to listen to more to see where they're coming. When can you expect them to arrive? So through the organization, everybody went along and we numbered all the stations. We tried to standardize on LDH when that came out. I believed in 5-inch, but others prevailed, and I see everything is back down to 4, which doesn't make any sense to me. If you require 6-inch water mains as a minimum, 1,500 gallon a minute pumpers, and then you supply with a 4-inch, which can't supply the 1,500 gallons a minute without another pumper on the hydrant. But again, a waste of manpower by putting that engine back on the hydrant to pump up where you could have laid the proper size hose. Through the San Jose Fire Department and a salesman by the name of Bob Brand, I learned about the Innerschutz in Germany. And in '88, I went to Germany, and with the San Jose Fire Department, because they had a sister city program with a small volunteer fire department outside of Hanover, and that's where the Innerschutz was in those days. And at that point, I was able to take a side trip up to northern Germany, where my grandfather family had come from, and I was able to reestablish ties with family there in Germany. And I visited the fire department there. There was a relative, which in the 1920s had received appreciation for over 20-some years as a volunteer fireman there. And also in that town, there is a fire museum. So on a subsequent trip, I took one of my uniforms there. So I'm in that fire museum. My uniform is there. The only complaint I have, I'm awful cute. The mannequin's a female that have my uniform on. But and when I retired, they sent me a chief's uniform from the fire department there. The Innerschutz, it was a great experience. Bobby Brand and I, we rode aerials, 150-foot aerials. That's the elevators that go on them. So we got on the elevator and shot up to the top 150 feet. On a later trip, we went over, rode the Bronco, 230 feet in the air. There they design, and they have it built into the equipment so it doesn't violate it, the computer. You reach up high. They're not interested in reaching horizontal reach like we test our equipment. In Germany, the responsibility of the building is to get people down, I think, to the 4th floor. And it's the fire department's responsibility to get them from there down to the ground with the various aerials that they have. There was very little American equipment there, but it was international, so there was equipment from all over the world there. It was an international trade fair, and it was held every 6 years. And so you saw the latest of everything there, from ambulances to boats to rescue, hazmat. And one of the things interesting in the Germans, we toured a number of the stations from Hanover, Hamburg, and Munich, major cities, and saw how they operated. And they specialize, first of all, you're hired not because you're a strong back, you're hired because you have a specialty that they want in the fire service. You could be, you could be a mechanic, but you had to be a master mechanic. You could be if you were a chemist, you worked in hazmat. So you worked your trades and responded to the calls as needed. So they had the mechanics, they had the abilities to machine and work on things. So they weren't farming things out to have it done. They did it all in-house. And tailors, they had everything there. It was quite, even in Munich, big training ground indoors because of the foul weather there. We'd train with the pompier ladders just to climb up on there for build up confidence. The other things was the maze. A number of years ago, we had a vehicle come through here with the maze in it, but that was a requirement going through the maze and work your trade in there. So if you had to take out a valve, you had to work it with all of your gear on and find your way in and out. So it was taken very the responsibility was quite there. Also, the equipment is standardized. In other words, the firemen don't design the apparatus. The apparatus builders submit to the government, and the government would pay 30% of the cost as part of national defense. Of course, that was during the Cold War and things like that. I don't know if it still pertains. So things were pushed along by industry competing with one another. And in this country, my opinion, I heard it from salesmen, is it's designed by the firemen with the chief's approval because the chief still wants to know how to operate it, so things don't advance like they could. Sausalito, first of all, during the war, became a shipyard. Hills were leveled, the bay was filled because we had rail came into Sausalito. They dredged a channel on up. Within 90 days of deciding to build a shipyard there, they were laying the keel for the very first ship. And building the shipyard right around it as they were doing the construction. So these buildings went up, plate shops, and then at the end of the war, everything was shut down and then deteriorated, sold off, and for a long time, clear back into the early 70s, there wasn't a lot of development going there. But the ground had all settled in those slabs of concrete, and we had numerous homeless people, hippies, whatever, drug addicts, all living underneath these concrete slabs. And again, everything was rotting. We had a lot of fires down in those areas. You know, nothing real big. The biggest fires were Madden Lewis Boatyard. That burned there when I was in the College of Marin, so that had to be very early 60s. There was no hydrants out there, except for a little wharf hydrant, one of those 2-inch pipes going out. And that was pretty near a block off of Bridgeway, but it blistered the paint on buildings on Bridgeway. And then when I was in the service, that's when the distillery burned, and perhaps people responded from all over the county down there. Perhaps Bob was there. My brother Larry came from Tiburon, and he wrote me a letter describing how the creeks and the gutters are all burning blue from all the alcohol that was burning going down the ditches. The stories I heard were, you know, Juanita Munson was there with her coffee pot, and everybody was pouring booze into the coffee, making coffee royals. As things calmed down a little bit, there was an awful lot of liquor got moved into trunks of cars and disappeared. And everybody was sitting around feeling pretty smug, and then the federal agents came in looking for the missing liquor, and panic set all over town, and everybody was nervous for quite a while. But those are some of the major fires there in Sausalito's history. It's a small thing, but I think preserving the history of the association. Kenny Camp had made this mallet. Big mallet, he glued all his wood together, real nice mallet, and would bring the meeting to order with that mallet. I then created a plaque and researched all the previous chiefs of the Marin County who were president of the Marin County Fire Chiefs Organization. So I made this plaque up. And so now everyone's recorded on there who's been president of the association. And I will be going to the next installation to make sure the plaque is there and check to make sure it's updated. That's something the history is too easily lost. And that's why I think your interviewing of all the chiefs there, past and perhaps present, is important. The history needs to be recorded. It was a county association prior to that. And their last meeting was held at Tiburon Fire Department, probably in 1965 or that time frame, because the meeting was downstairs, and we were upstairs arm wrestling with Bunk Mercereau upstairs, and they kept hearing all this commotion upstairs, and we were trying to brace ourselves, clonk our feet. So anyway, that was the last meeting, and it was the assistant chief of Sausalito who became the first president of the Marin County Fire Chiefs Organization. It was a Marin County Association, I think, firemen or something like that, and this is when it became part of Cal Chiefs also. But I was arm wrestling with Bunk Mercereau, and I beat him. And now I reflect back on it. Here he was up in his 70s, and I was in my 20s. What a strong guy that was. You know, I mean, he was an amazing man. And a little story about Bunk is he was down in Hooper's Bar one time, and a bunch of guys from Cal or someplace came over, and they nudged him, maybe rather forcibly, and move over, old man, because they wanted to all get up into the bar. Well, Bunk took them all on, beat the hell out of them all, and he got arrested for beating up all these young guys. You know, and he had to be in his 70s at that time. But he was a prize fighter, football player with the old leather helmets. He would go up and meet the ships as they came in and take on the boxer of the ship. And that's how he picked up his extra change and spare change during the 30s and 40s. Yeah. It was a career greater than any expectations I ever had for my life, and the most rewarding experience. I came through at a time, it may not be possible to do the same thing again as I did it, because this was before the unions, before fair labor standards. You could volunteer a lot of time in the fire department. And it was the volunteers in the fire department. My basis was in Tiburon, volunteer department paid, and we had volunteers in Sausalito. So you did your job, then there was fire prevention, there was training officers, all that was volunteer time by the people involved when off duty. You know, and people who lived close to the department, they were a part of it. It was truly, I would call it a family. People were close-knit, you socialized together. It was good times. But I think, you know, coming in today, you know, you got to get the education. You got to have some practical experience. You know, the fastest track now, I guess, is getting your paramedic certification. But as you move up through the ranks and you want to become a chief officer, one of the things I had learned from Buck Maston and his experience down at El Monte where he left Sausalito for, you got to get involved in the community. You got to have roots in the community. And otherwise, you can be too easily picked on by council, city managers, or whatever. If you have a good basis in the community loves you, what you're doing. Myself, I was very, very involved in the Rotary and the Sausalito Art Festivals. I invested like the farmer. You got to put back into your community if you want to keep reaping benefits from that field. And that's my recommendation. You become a chief officer or start moving up those ladders, get involved in that community. And I was able to get involved in that community as a fire prevention officer. I got to know all the merchants downtown and work with them reasonably. You know, just keep getting things better rather than writing up a long list and says, here's all the things you got to do, which now people are going to balk at. That was one of the things Swede Peterson had taught me. Just keep moving it along, and things will keep getting better. But community involvement, you got to have that base. And I had my run-ins with city managers, sometimes council people. But when you have a broad community base and the community likes what you're doing, they'll stand up for you. And I had that experience there where this temporary city manager thought it was time for me to retire. I could have retired, but I wasn't ready to retire. I was happily working for 25 cents on the dollar, and I wanted to stay there until my daughter was finished with her college education. And when she finished her education and we got rid of that temporary city manager who wanted to terminate me, well, I outlasted him, and I was going to plan to retire underneath his predecessor, which I did. I retired in 95. April 15th, I had to put a little lining on that particular tax day. If I could magically rewind it, absolutely, absolutely. And to be able to know what I know now, I would have studied more in English in class instead of daydreaming. Because English skills, you got to have those writing skills. And you got to, you know, for young officers, you got to document things. Keep a diary, keep what's going on. Be positive with the employees. But, you know, if you don't have the documentation when it comes to discipline, it's unenforceable.